Welcome to the Cascadian Prophets Podcast, a production of the Cascadia Poetics Lab, empowering people to practice poetry and deepen connections to place, self, and the present moment. The Beat Generation is one of the most formidable literary movements of the mid to late 20th and 21st centuries. Its innovative connections to emerging postmodernisms, collapsing boundaries among genres such as fiction, verse, and memoir, between private and public life, between fact and invention, between and among sexual identities and desires, coincided with the social justice movements in the United States and abroad. Its radical experimental poetics challenged forms and rhetorics of conventional as well as speculative literary arts languages. The Beat Studies book series attempts to deepen understandings of the Beat generation, highlighting previously under-recognized Beat artists and understudied dimensions of the Beat movement. These words open the book Joanne Kyger, Poet in Place and Time, a new book of essays examining the work of the longtime Bolinas, California resident poet, whose work has been described by one critic this way: handling her poetry is like handling a porcupine traveling at the speed of light. Jane Falk and Mary Paniccia Carden are the co-editors and my guests today via Zoom to discuss the book and the poet. Thank you for your time today. Welcome to the Zoom room, and I'm very grateful that you're here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
What was, tell us about how you first decided this should be a book.
Well, I think I might handle that question. I was talking shortly after Joanne's passing to one of the Beat Studies book series editors, and she asked me if I had ever thought about writing about Joanne. And that was in 2017, and sort of the idea sort of sat around in my head for a while, and eventually in actually 2019, I met Mary at a conference, and in 2021, we started to work on the book as co-editors. And in the meantime, I wrote an essay and she wrote an essay about Joanne.
How did you first both meet or become, I should say, become aware of the work of Joanne Kyger?
Oh, gosh. For me, it was, I think I was a graduate student. So a long time ago, I had been introduced to the work of, Kerouac, Burroughs, Ginsberg, and I stumbled upon Diane de Prima and thought, imagine that, there's women involved in this thing. And then I started actively looking for other women writers who were associated in some way with the Beat movement. So that's how I came upon Joanne Kyger and was just immediately struck by the uniqueness of her voice.
Yeah. For me, I met Joanne at Naropa in the 1990s. I'm not sure exactly what date, but I had always wanted to go to Naropa. And I was in grad school and I went there and took a class from her, Zen in the Beats. And I became, friends with her. I interviewed her. I met her in Bolinas. And from then on, I knew Joanne Kyger.
Yeah, she had a way. She was quite a elegant hostess when you visited her. Andrew Schelling said she had the ability to take snacks that she got on an airplane flight and present them to you in such a way that you felt it was wonderful or something like that. In the intro, there's this notion, what matters in poetry is not ideas, according to Joanne, so much as living in your environment. That she was in Bolinas for so long, I think puts some power behind that statement. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, she was definitely an echo poet. She was into inhabitory poetics long before it became like a buzzword. That was in the 70s when she got involved with that movement and the whole issue of water and sewage in Bolinas. She was part of that movement of awareness. So I'm not sure that's part of it.
Those are two great threads that I definitely want to follow up on. So, um, when you mention the sewage incident or the issue of sewage, the average person doesn't know what you're talking about. So maybe you can tell the story about how a grassroots movement rose up and stopped a sewage treatment plant from being built that would have radically, perhaps overpopulated Bolinas.
Should I answer that, Mary, or are you?
I think you're more familiar with that than I am.
Yeah, there was an issue of sewage being put into the Pacific Ocean, and they wanted to combine Bolinas with other places like Stinson Beach in Marin to build a giant sewage treatment plant, which would open up Bolinas to more people and overpopulation of its own small water system, which was a creek that was the watershed. And she and other people in Bolinas took over the city council, the Bolinas Council, and sort of stopped that from happening and built a series of sewer treatment ponds in Bolinas itself, which solved the problem. And they were able to maintain their small scale life there.
So that you would ascribe to ecopoetics because there's a sense of the ecology, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about how she would fall under that banner of ecopoetics. I know that Jonathan Skinner's essay in the book outlines that very well, but what does it mean to you when you say she practices ecopoetics?
To me, and this might veer a little bit away, from the established definitions, but for me, it's about being in and of one's environment, and her subjects, the subjects of her poems, are very much of that lived being in life around you, not sealed off in your head somewhere, but in the world and in the moment. It's not the classical definition of poetics, but that's one thing that's always struck me about her.
That sounds also very much like reinhabitation, which comes out of the bioregional movement, which, as a person who runs a thing called the Cascadia Poetics Lab, you can imagine it's important to us as well. And really started in the Bay Area with people like Peter Berg, Planet Drum Foundation. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? Basically, Gary, her ex, said that bioregionalism is stay put, watch what happens. And that's exactly what she did.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yeah. There's another.
And also learn from the people that lived there before you, which was part of her ethos also, to not just have the modern Western voice, but to go back and hear the previous voices. And that goes for her interest in going to Mexico also, where she heard those previous voices more, say, strongly, or they had more power there because there were more of those voices left in Mexico.
And when you look at the travel chapbooks, that just comes out so strongly. And of course, Up My Coast, which deals with the work of the previous inhabitants.
Right, Up My Coast, which came, the material from which came from a book that outlined the indigenous presence in that part of the world. And so she went into some of the mythology of that in a poem. So that's what you're referring to.
Yes.
Yeah. There's another practice of her dating her writing. To me, it suggests it's a timeline for her own individuation. And the phrase, an accumulative narrative of chronology, also comes up in connection with that. Tell us about that practice. I know that Ginsberg all did it regularly, but not quite as religiously as Joanne did. Talk to us about that practice.
I think we've
Well,
both.
actually, oh, go
Oh,
ahead, Mary. Well, I was going to say that part of that influence is Philip Whalen, who religiously dated his poetry just to distinguish it from other people, partly. And she was a great friend of Philip Whalen, and I think that might have been an influence on her own practice of doing that. But it's also part of that, as Mary was saying, being in touch with the world around you. What day is it? That's how to begin that day's journal entry, that day's poem, is to put down the date.
There's a phrase that comes out of Soto Zen and Dogen, a particular Dharma position. You know, you can't step in the same moment twice, you might paraphrase. And I think that may have been part of the influence too, because they were both Buddhists. Yeah. Mary, page 43 in your essay, you write that Kyger creates mythic space. Here's a quote: "Not a tangible entity or physical space, so much as a means of expressing modes of thought and perception fundamental to her worldview." And then a couple of pages later, Kyger accomplishes just such transformational joinings in her creation of mythic space, poetic fusions of temporalities, geographies, and states of being. Can you talk about Joanne's mythic space and what you mean by that?
I mean, essentially, you know, this kind of combination or integration or kind of refusal of boundary that we see in her. You know, so if you look, especially my essay was focused, of course, on the tapestry and the web. But if you dive into those poems, one thing that kind of leaps to my mind is the long poem, which is aptly named. It's a very long poem, where there's these unpredictable movements and shifts between place, time, persona, right, that make it difficult to kind of freeze the world into a single thing, right? This is a kind of multiplicity and a lens on the world that's so myriad as to open us to all possible experience and perception in that moment that she's expressing.
That makes it hard to anthologize that kind of work, because the anthologies, yeah, tell us.
Yeah, and if you look at anthologies, you'll see that I mean, there's a couple poems that reoccur, but you see people really kind of struggling with what to put in. And I think it's a reason why she is underrepresented. You know, she's very hard to pigeonhole. One of the things that we were really careful of, you know, when we were, you know, producing a text within the Beat Studies series, was to make sure that we acknowledged all of the kind of career trajectory that you could place her in, so many different moments, and she didn't like to be called a beat poet. You know, so we tried to honor that.
There's a poem in About Time, I think it is, where she's being asked about being a female beat poet, and she's stuffing a scarf down the person's mouth. That's an example of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she'd say in interviews, you know, that she didn't, you know, she just didn't think of herself that way, and at moments didn't feel particularly welcome either.
Yeah. On page 80, in relation to the work of Gary Snyder, to whom she was married for a couple of years, is this phrase, quote, "a gendered alternative to what poetry's supposed to do." Do you remember that quote and the context? Because I think some of the essays, Linda Russo's in particular, uses the phrase proto-feminist to describe Joanne. And I think that's accurate. And I think it also explains a lot, not only that she's hard to pigeonhole, was that she didn't get recognized as much, but also that she was a woman in what was very much a male-dominated field, and to some extent continues to be. So That quote I found very interesting, a gendered alternative to what poetry is supposed to do. How does that manifest in her work? How is it different from maybe other beat poets or other poets in general?
I think that she's talking in terms of Buddhism and the idea of the ordinary in Buddhism, and that her approach to Buddhism was different than, say, Gary Snyder's. Hers was more of a messy kind of approach to Buddhism, and his was more of a clean and neat and tidy approach to Buddhism, which, in a sense, goes against woman as domestic person and goes into woman as a person rather than pigeonholing her in that way. So I think in the context of Sarah's essay, that is part of what that essay is about. I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but that's part of what Joanne was about too, because she didn't necessarily like to be called a feminist poet. I know in one interview with Nancy Grace and Ronna Johnson, she sort of dismissed that, wanting to be pigeonholed as a feminist poet. She was just a poet.
Another way too to think of that. I'm thinking of Linda Russo's essay in Nancy and Ronna's collection to deal with part in particulars, right? Where she's, and you see this in the journal, where she's thinking about Ezra Pound's kind of pronouncement about what a great poet is and what great poetry is. And it's not like these little, parts and particulars and details. It's something grand and epic. And she dealt in parts and particulars, and she made those things poetry. So I think if you look at the Japan and India journals, you can see her kind of feeling her way toward, what is my focus? And she responds to that kind of prohibition on like the little things of life with, poems about sweeping the step, So I think that's a kind of thinking of what does it mean to be a female poet, and what might a female poetics look like to her. She's not interested in telling, as Jane said, of being made some kind of an exemplar of feminist poetry at all, but she's thinking through gender roles and expectations early on, where the proto-feminist, there wasn't a vocabulary available to her. So she's thinking it through on her own.
She knew that something didn't feel right when she went to Japan, and she was expected to keep the house, and she felt that sometimes she just wants to let the dishes sit there for a while, which I can relate to.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
That
Gary Snyder wanted her to do that. Right.
Say again?
Gary Snyder didn't want to give her permission to do that.
Right.
In that exchange that she records.
Right. Yeah, and then there's the passage about the Secchio notebook, and I think of her, and you just mentioned the journal. I think of her later journalesque poetry collections. The quote from the book is, "Comprise an alternative genre that merges poetry, travelogue, and dream diary, seamlessly combining historical and mythic themes with memory and sensory impression, all interspersed with spiritual and philosophical inquiry." Poetry travelogue, dream diary, the fact that there's extensive journaling throughout her life, and this gives us, like you just mentioned, a track to see how her thoughts and how her cosmology evolved. Is that part of what gives Kyger a sort of a rich field for scholars?
Well, I think for these two scholars, yeah. Jane and I have both written on, Jane coined the phrase journal as genre, and we've both addressed her work that way.
And there are so many different aspects to Joanne herself, and that's what I think this book. I mean, we had a title, Poet in Place and Time, but yet it sort of goes beyond that to all kinds of different aspects of Joanne that you wouldn't really necessarily think about. And I think that's what's interesting about this particular book. I mean, when you open up Joanne to examination, you get a lot of different angles.
Right. One of them is certainly the Buddhist connection and the notion of compassion. There's Jonathan Skinner's great essay, and the passage that interests me is, quote, in meditating on interdependence or conditioned arising and realizing the ignorance that binds mental formations to the chain of cause and effect, compassion can act freely. A meditation that for the poet includes matters of poetic form and syntax. The sustained record of this generosity is also a teaching or dharma. Kyger's poem addresses the generosity of the Bodhisattva, a dedication to the liberation of all sentient beings through accepting reincarnation, or, quote, the thrill of a lifetime once more. Let me just pull up on the screen that particular poem because I did a screen grab for it and you can see it. Once again, another century ahead. Again, is this happening again? This is the thrill of a lifetime once more. Continual conscious compassion. Does this include even what you don't like? Oh, ick. and I see this what may have attracted the beats to Buddhism, and that's this notion of openness and this notion that many things can go in the poem. It doesn't have to be that single subject short poem that's anthologizable. Can you talk about the quote, the poem, and about the similarities in the open stance toward poetry and poetry that influenced her and towards living?
Well, I mean, the first thing I think about is Robert Duncan and Charles Olson and open space and the whole idea of the poem is a line moving back and forth, allowing the space of the world to come into the poem. And that's partly what we really worked hard to deal with Joanne's poetry, is to show those lines accurately, to record her voice. I'm sure Mary has something to say about this too.
Well, I'm struck with the openness just in the acknowledge the ick, even things I don't like. So I mean, there's an openness there to the. I'm not sure exactly what I'm trying to say here. It just kind of sprung into my head that kind of compassion is kind of a radical thing and maybe not that easy. And there's this humorous acknowledgement of that, in poetic form that I love those lines.
It brings it back to earth. I mean, all this Buddhist
Yeah.
talk is all nice, but then when it comes down to it, there's this look you get on your face. Oh, ick! I don't have to do that too, do I? And the answer is yes, but that's what makes it difficult, right? Yeah. Skinner also quotes an interview in which Kyger described her work as daily writing as unself-conscious, open utterance, freed from considerations of genre, being as clear as you can or muddled as you want. Also describing that openness, right? I think.
Right. Poetry is both open in form and content. So that's sort of another aspect of that openness.
On page 179, you write, Jane, you write this, most importantly, such writing can also situate poets in their historical moment. How can poets take this cue from Kyger and begin to situate themselves in their historical moment? You're talking at this point of the book about her sort of shift towards more political content. NAFTA, you mentioned treatment of indigenous people, the Chiapas uprising and other events like that. She had something to say about it, and it came up in her poems.
Yeah, it seemed like after sort of the first Iraq War, she became more politically not so much conscious, because she was with the Sewer Ponds project too, but she started to write about politics more in her poems. And she was sort of like upset that more younger people weren't more politically conscious at that time. And so I think that not necessarily wanting to be part of history, but just accepting that poetry can and should be part of history was something that became more and more evident to her. She had to do this, even if the writing was a little more didactic than some of her other writing.
Yeah.
I think too that if you think about her practice of just noting the date, right? That political things are in your ecosystem. It's part of the forces that are shaping the world that you are in and of. So it's something of a false dichotomy to say that poetry can't be poetic, because if it's a poetry of the daily, which her poetry so is, and a poetry that accounts for one's being in the world, how do you say this SOAR project has no place in poetry, or in my thinking about poetry, or what's happening at this moment has no place?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Mary.
Another
She included daily life, and that was political at that time.
Yeah. Another phrase which further elaborates on this is, the job of the poet is less about finding one's voice than it is a matter of listening closely to the, quote, community bulletin board in which everyone is a reporter.
Yeah. What is that a quote from?
It's I think it's early in the book. I don't have the page number written down here. I could surely find it if given a moment. But of course, this refers to, I mean, this brings up this notion of the, small town journalistic work that she was involved in Bolinas, and helping really create the news, or report the news, at least as she saw it, for a long time. And in towns like Bolinas, and in times like when she was writing, that was a very valuable news source. Today's equivalent may be the radio, maybe a Facebook page for a neighborhood, but she was there doing that. And this notion that everyone is a reporter, which with Kyger's cosmology, that would include several species of birds and all the other critters around her house. And that would be part of the news, the
Right.
small things that you talk about.
Well, the hearsay news still exists, the Bolinas newspaper. Yeah.
I did not know that. Um, is Kyger's postmortem stock going up in her afterlife? I mean, I see parallels to Lorene Niedecker, who Kyger had read, and whose objectivist tactics Kyger in part employed, or at least was said to have employed. Do you see a bright future for Joanne's work now that she's gone? And maybe she's helping us from the other side.
I sort of hate to think about things like this, but I suppose our book is an example of something that happened after Joanne's passing. So, I mean, the fact that people think more about poets after they're gone is sad, but I suppose true. I don't know about the future. I heard of some other projects, but I don't know for sure.
I think, and in some ways, I've considered, our work as kind of as part of an ongoing interest in women who were associated with the Beats, that started, maybe with most visibility with Nancy Arana's work. And I think that the Beat Studies community is relatively small when you think of, academic associations. But I like to think of it as a continuation and something that would hopefully continue to grow. I can see, for instance, younger scholars continuing to be really interested in her as an her ecopoetics, right? This is such a crucial way of thinking, and so important for the present day, what we're dealing with, that I can see her being of really significant interest as people encounter her work. And we like to think that our book will help with that, introducing people that maybe wouldn't have seen that much of her previously.
Yeah, the age of global warming needs Joanne Kyger's voice.
The book helped me understand Kyger's work better, and I knew her and brought her to town here on a couple of occasions, and still her work is myriad-minded, and it's not easy to get a grip on. And I think that's part of why geniuses like this, I think of Carla Bley as well, who just died about a year or so ago, it's hard to get a handle on them until they're dead, at which time we can begin to take stock. It makes it easier. It's unfortunate that it happens that way, but you can see how that happens with people who are, quite frankly, are ahead of their time, right?
Especially people that do not self-promote themselves in the way that Joanne did not self-promote herself. And, that's that just a poem I was looking at today before I came here, Living a Spiritual Life in the Woods, for Alice and Douglas, Alice Notley, and she's responding to the statement that she lives a spiritual and quiet life in the woods, which of course isn't really true because Bolinas isn't even in the woods, but it's sort of her acknowledgement that, well, I'm really here, even though you don't think I am.
Off the beaten path. Do you want to read that poem?
Well, it's sort of a long poem. Let me just, I'll just read the beginning. At least it's simple to mind the wild honeysuckle, and now the monarch butterfly has returned, for the season's changing light deepens. Now you see her, now the woods for the trees and light morning breeze, and a car trundles down the dirt road. But it is not for her the noon whistle blows, announcing the end of the morning sitting, cross-legged with cross thoughts. Life is short and there is no one to talk to on the telephone. I mean, you sort of have to, you can't really see this very well right now, but it's her different ways of putting the poem on the page, which is really, it's an important part of Joanne, and it's a way that we can hear her voice and what she's wanting to emphasize.
And how she wants her words to be replicated in someone else's voice. It's a musical score, as projective verse suggested poets can do with the advent of the typewriter to compose one's work, as Ezra Pound did in incarceration in Italy. I found the book to be fantastic. I loved having it. I love getting the PDF in advance, and I love holding the hardcover book in my hand, and I really think it's essential. She was definitely underrated in my view, and so that makes the work of people like you really, really critical and really, really appreciated. So I'm grateful not only to have this book, but also to have this time with you this morning to talk about Joanne, whose work I love very much. And thank you for this.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, we wanted to have a shout out, though, to somebody who actually took this cover photo, and that's Donald Gurovich. He took the photo of her studio, too, inside, and he was really helpful in many, many steps along the way.
He was very encouraging and very generous. And he's a tremendous steward of her work and her legacy.
Cascadian Prophet supporters include Diana Elser, a sponsorship dedicated to her parents whose practicality, humor, and love of family life reflected their experience in and love for the Missouri Breaks and Ruby Valley, Montana landscapes that define their childhoods. And for the memory of Glenn and Jesse Dodge, a World War I vet and his wife, world-class grandparents and farmers in the town of Gate, Washington. Cascadian Prophets is a production of the Cascadia Poetics Lab, founded in 1993. More interviews and lots of information on our website, cascadianprophets.org.